Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm J.R. DeShazo, Director of the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation. Our center seeks to solve our most challenging environmental problems, focusing on climate, clean energy, sustainable transportation, and water. I'd like to kick off this session by thanking our co-host, the UCLA Burkle Center for International Relations, who helped organize this event. And I'd like to give a special shout out and thank you to Sarah Nichols for playing such a critical role in making this webinar possible. As a land-grant institution here in California, we at UCLA acknowledge and honor the sacrifice of the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples, as they were the traditional caretakers of the land upon which our campus now stands. I'm very excited to welcome you all and to introduce this star-studded panel that we have for you today. Our panel is going to be moderated by Kate Guy. Kate comes to us from London this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you're dialing in from. She currently serves as Deputy Director for the International Military Council on Climate and Security, and is a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Climate and Security. Kate, thank you so much for joining us today. Oh, and let me just, there's one responsibility that I did not discharge. Those of you in the audience, one housekeeping detail: if you would like to resize any of the frames that are currently in front of you, you can click and drag from the bottom right corner. And sort of adjust your screen to whatever's comfortable to you as an arrangement. Sorry about that, Kate. Thank you. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, JR. And I think I also have to wish you a very happy birthday today, too, because you are here with us when you should be off celebrating to talk about some very weighty topics. So we appreciate that. And thanks to all of you, and happy to be with you today. As JR said, we're going to dive into some intense discussions, I would say, about national security and climate change and how these two very big issues come together. And to start us off, before we get into a really esteemed and distinguished panel to talk about how they've seen these threats play out in their lives, I wanted to give you all a look behind the scenes a little bit at some very new research into exactly how we can anticipate and forecast these threats throughout really the next 100 years, right? What climate change might look like and how it might impact our security down the line. And to start us off on that, I wanted to give us a quick look at where we are now. So this is a graph that shows almost right up to date, as of last year, what carbon emissions look like globally. And you can see in the black line sort of historical emissions and where we're at now. Oops, sorry about that. And where we're at now, and sort of what we call projections and futures looking forward. Sorry, I think somebody's moving this on me. And when we look at these graphs, we can see two really starkly different futures, even if it might not look like that. So in the green and yellow lines, these are futures that are sort of in line with science, what science tells us we need to do if we want to preserve a safe future for us here on Earth. And that means rapidly changing where we're at in terms of our emissions, and actually by the end of the century, probably getting to net negative emissions very rapidly. And that will keep us in a safe climate. Now, if we don't do that, if we sort of follow the blue lines here or the gray line instead, which is that baseline, sort of what humans have been doing up until now, we get into really scary, I would say, territory in terms of global warming. And so if we even just implemented all of the policies we have on the books right now, the world would still probably realize as much as 3 degrees of global average warming centigrade from historic levels. If we do worse than that, right, if at some point we roll back all of the policies we have on the books now, which of course many around the world are trying to do, and emit many more fossil fuels, we might get to well over 4 degrees, even pushing 5 degrees of global average warming by the end of the century. And these might sound like small numbers, especially for us Americans who are used to dealing in Fahrenheit, right? But these mean huge changes. Just for relevance, the world has already warmed just about 1 degree centigrade warming now. So all the impacts, all the effects that we're seeing, that's only at about 1 degrees. So if we're thinking 4, 5, even beyond that by the end of the century, we're really looking at a wholly different climate. So what does that mean for us when we think about security and national security at that, how the US protects itself and protects its citizens? There are many ways to think of this, and luckily our leaders in national security have been thinking about this for a very long time, right? Going back even to the 90s, the Pentagon, our intelligence experts, the sort of National Intelligence Council has been thinking about how climate change might impact our security. And we'll hear very soon about how many of our security leaders have seen this sort of come online and start threatening what they are responsible for over time. But to start us off, I think there's 3 big ways we all can think about climate change and its relation to security. So the first is what we call first order. These are physical shocks that climate change itself is involved in making more frequent or more intense. And these are things that, unfortunately, we're all now seeing every day, right? It's that direct hit from a horrible fire, or from, we're all thinking about New Orleans tonight, of course, as that Hurricane Zeta rapidly intensifies off its shores. This is sea level rise, which will make many storm surges even higher. This is stress to our food and water and resource systems. And these are directly impacting, as Californians, you all know, impacting our lives and our safety in our communities right now. That's a security impact. But when we start thinking about the second order impact, so what happens after that disaster happens, that's when we start seeing even wider array of security impacts. So you might see people displaced from their homes, which is probably in a way horrible, but they need to get out of danger's way and migrate somewhere else. You see health risks, and we know the destabilizing impact that health can have these days more than ever. Under future climate change scenarios, it's likely that infectious diseases are going to become more frequent, spread further, and health impacts from heat stress to other impacts will really impact human life. What you also might start seeing when you see these disasters and impacts add up over time is increased state fragility and even conflict or perhaps violence in communities. One thing I think of often in this case is ISIS in the past few years has been documented to use drought and use food stress in Iraq to recruit more people to sort of come and join its ranks because they're otherwise sort of forced from their livelihoods. This is a real security threat that we're seeing pile on after the direct impacts of climate change. And then beyond that, those things don't sort of stay at that national level, right? All of these things don't recognize borders, and climate change itself doesn't recognize borders. They will naturally bubble up to that international level of international global security. So we think of this in terms of ungoverned spaces like the Arctic, where countries might start competing over new resources and new areas that are melting. It's also increased militarization, right, of borders, of resources that otherwise might be peacefully managed now, but might increasingly become more and more securitized as they become very contested or precious. This is also sort of down the line, seemingly crazy security risks like geoengineering. This is sort of a mad scientist picture, but what if we get so desperate that we start trying to manage our local climates and do crazy things to clouds or science fiction stuff? What does that mean for the unintended consequences that might add up down the line as well? So we can think of this across direct impacts to second and third, and potentially even fourth, fifth order consequences, right? These threats cascade down the line and affect things that we don't even know or see coming. So I was very lucky to be involved and to be the lead investigator on a bit of research earlier this year with another distinguished group of national security and military and intelligence professionals who've all served in US roles to look at what do we mean when we think of security across this century when it comes to climate change, and what might it look like under different scenarios of warming, right? So we'll think back to that graph I showed you in the beginning of we could go one path, which keeps things relatively safe, or we could go another path, which really gets out of hand. So we came together and looked at, under these two scenarios of warming, at every combatant command, right? So every region that the US is currently operating in the world. What would security impacts look like in those spaces? And I've got a map for you of that first scenario of warming, what that might look like. So this is, if we let the world warm to about 2 degrees centigrade, which we currently would sort of hit about mid-century, so 2050. This is what each region, each combatant command that the US military is present in will face. And these are medium to high, in some cases, very high security risks already at this, quote, low level of warming, right? So it's that water stress and resource stress and displacement, very high heat, even a little bit of great power tension thrown in. And as you can see, every region of the world is sort of facing these consequences. But if we look sort of towards the end of the century, towards where we're currently headed for over 2, 3, even 4 and more degrees of warming by 2100, the Earth starts to look even more terrifying. So purple in this case is not a good color, right? It's what's worse than deepest, darkest red when you're looking at a temperature map. It's shocking purple. And as you can see, this level of warming poses high, very high, and even catastrophic risks to each region of the world. And catastrophic is not certainly a word that security experts use very often. It can seem hyperbolic, but what it means in this case is that there are risks that are so immense and so disastrous that they're probably irreversible, right? The effects are sort of impacting every element of society that you might not be able to come back from that level of risk. So what can we think about across all of these findings? The first is something I've said already. No area of the world is going to be unaffected by this. I'm often asked, looking at these scenarios, who is the winner and who are the losers here? But if you really look at it, even at low levels, all countries are impacted in really negative ways. And so there won't be some country who's massively benefiting from these things happening. It's going to be disastrous and bubble up each of those layers in every region. And each of those regions are going to face severe security consequences to their security environments that they operate in, the institutions that they rely on, and infrastructure that sort of keeps them in operation. And finally, from the US perspective, I mean, I'm sure this is clear, but these effects are impacting the entire world, but will especially hurt US interests in terms of our citizens here at home and safety of Americans in the homeland, but also our interests abroad, which are vast and immense. A couple other things to think about in terms of the global nature of these threats. And I think this is important, especially in a time of COVID, right, where you see risks every day that are sort of cascading and changing from a health risk into an economic collapse into potentially a new type of risk. And there are a few ways to think about what the world looks like in this reality. The first is just rising instability, right? Especially in places with ongoing conflicts or histories of conflicts. This is just adding fuel to those fires. The next is the risk of uninhabitability, right? That there are some parts of the world that you might not even be able to live in because they're too flooded or too hot to really go outside. Where do all those people go? And what do we do as a world to sort of welcome them to a new area if they're no longer able to inhabit their homeland? There are those international tensions that I'm talking about. What do we think about blame here? How do our adversaries take advantage of these threats? What about our institutions at the international level? Are they able to stay strong in the face of many of these threats? And then finally, there unfortunately are many threats coming which are wild cards. We can't say what they will be because we've never seen anything like them before. This is what intelligence experts might call a low probability but high impact event. So something like the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet or a huge release of permafrost emissions in the northern Arctic region, both which would have immense consequences. But we can't say for sure if they'll happen or when they'll happen yet because the science just isn't that sophisticated yet. But if they did, they would have untold impact. So to wrap up this section before we hear from the sources, I wanted to offer us hopefully some less depressing material, and those are recommendations, right? So what should we do about this, especially since looking into this future is so devastating and wrought? The first is that our panel of national military leaders and security leaders came together, and what I am aware of is the first time that security leaders have actually called for something to be done of the core problem of climate change. So these leaders said we need to achieve net zero global emissions as soon as possible. And we need to do so in a way that is ambitious, yes, but that's also safe and equitable, right, with elements of justice and well-governed, so that we can actually avoid most of what you saw on these maps and not get to that point of severity. While we're doing that, we have to actually walk and chew gum at the same time. So make huge progress on mitigating climate change, but also adapt to those effects that are already here and present with us. And we can think of this as sort of climate proofing our environments, right? Our infrastructure, our institutions, any system on which human security depends. We need to think about how climate change is going to impact that and harden it and make it resilient to those impacts, which we can see coming based on these great projections. And then finally, and this is one that I think is important, more important with each passing day, with the election next week, and with a potential new administration coming in or the next administration coming in, our leaders really need to be thinking about how to communicate and prioritize these threats and integrate them at the highest levels of planning. So with that, I'm going to pass it along to our great panel to think about and tell us and give us examples of how they've seen these threats in their own lives and things that they've done about it. So first up, we have the remarkable Admiral Fallon, who was an admiral with the U.S. Navy and had a distinguished 40-year career there. Admiral Fallon has led U.S. and allied forces in 8 separate commands and at the highest roles one can do so. He was head of U.S. Central Command, directing all military operations in the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Horn of Africa, regions that we know will see intense climate impacts in the future. He's responded to many of these events with the 2004 tsunami in Southeast Asia. On September 11th, he had the Pentagon as Vice Chief of the Navy, and so knows what it's like to serve in moments of crisis. And he, as we've been talking about, has really seen these climate threats up close at the highest levels, and is going to share with us what that has looked like from the perspective of our military. So, Admiral, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for the kind invitation. Good afternoon. My name is Bill Fallon. I served for 40 plus years in uniform around the world. Began life as a naval aviator flying from aircraft carriers and then moved on to other things. So I've spent a lot of time dealing with insecurities. And this is a very, very interesting topic, and I'm happy to be with you. I would think that I have some unique background that enabled me to see firsthand the reality of what's going on with the Earth, and also the resulting instabilities and challenges with people. And I guess it might be worth noting that when I was younger and just starting out in service, I understood national security to be mostly in terms of well-defined state borders. Back in the 60s when I began, it was the Cold War between the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc, the US and NATO primarily. And so things were very, very cut and dried. It was very military focused set of activities. But as I grew older and maybe a touch wiser, I began to see things in a little different light. And as I had the opportunity to visit with people around the world, I began to understand that security for the average person is much closer to home. The business of state entities wrestling for power and control is interesting, but I think people are much more concerned about things a lot closer to home. Their food, their shelter, their health, their economic well-being, their jobs, and so forth. And so it's in that light and with that experience that I'd like to mention a couple of observations here. I should also say that my last couple of assignments in uniform were commander of U.S. Pacific Command, with the responsibility for an area that went from the west coast of the United States across the Pacific They've encompassed most of East Asia, including China, Mongolia, Korea, Japan, India, so forth. And so I got to visit over 40 countries, meet the leaders, and meet many common people in these areas. And my last command was commander of U.S. Central Command, and that is the Middle East, then the Horn of Africa, and the rest of Central Asia, pretty much every country that ended up in a stand. And so in visiting these countries and watching people and seeing what went on, I began to notice and appreciate the severity of the issues that we face. And so the global trends in these areas are not good. They're not going in the right direction, primarily because the impact of the changing climate has a huge effect on people's lives. And again, if you get down to the very personal level, it's the ability to feed themselves. So as drought, for instance, in Africa expands south of the Sahara, we see people that have to live. They need water, they need food, they're looking for jobs. And as these things shrivel up and go away, they don't just stand there and wait for something to happen. They move, they migrate, they go to different places. And then that movement alone impacts the security of the areas, both where they came from and the areas that they're going to. And we've seen many, many examples of that. And as you see the seemingly endless waves of migrants that are coming to other countries in hope of a better life, I think one gets an appreciation for the impact and the things that are driving these activities. So there are lots of long-term effects. Again, I see them most typically manifested in food insecurity and sickness, and then the political instability that goes along with this. So when political leaders or national leaders, even regional leaders, can't come up with solutions to people's problems, people lose confidence in them, they lose trust in them, and they start looking around for other ways to get what they need. And this allows the introduction of a lot of bad actors. And as we look at problems in many places of the world, this can be traced back in many instances to the change in climate that affects people and, again, their basic needs that aren't being met. And so these insecurities tend to grow. Some of them turn into insurgencies and conflicts, and we're kind of off to the races. So I could spend a lot of time talking about individual countries and issues. People may have questions, but I would like to focus on things that I have personally observed that are the drivers of this activity in the world. And there are really three things. And I key on the change in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, an absolutely indisputable, dramatic rise in recent years that just seems to be climbing higher and higher. And this is a huge contributor to the warmth that we see, again, manifested in temperature change. Absolutely irrefutable, these changes. And I'm not talking about short-term things. I don't really focus on hurricanes or storms or, unfortunately, the fires. It's the long-term effect of this changing climate and the rising temperature that has huge effect on whole countries and areas of the world. And the third thing is something that might seem a little surprising to some, but that's ice. Having had an opportunity to visit the South Pole and actually had a responsibility for the Antarctic in terms of providing for the safety and welfare and security of all the scientific expeditions down there, I got a chance to go all over the continent. I've also spent a lot of time in the Arctic, in the high Arctic, the North Pole. And the reality is that the ice is melting, and it's melting in dramatically increasing fashion. And as this ice melts, it turns into water, and the sea levels are rising. And this is something that's going to cause, we can see it, it's predictable to a significant extent. And as these sea areas rise in low-lying land areas, it's going to cause instabilities because people aren't going to be able to, they need land to live on to have their homes, their villages, and so forth, and they're going to be forced out, and they're going to want to go somewhere where it's drier and they have a chance of living. And so it's a huge motivator. The other thing about ice is many of the mountainous regions of the world had held for centuries immense glaciers that over time have been the primary lifeline in terms of water, drinking water, for people to use. These glaciers around the world, almost without exception, are melting at a very rapid rate. And the squabbles that are beginning to ensue between countries over water rights have been there for a long time, but they're going to be exacerbated by this melting. So as we look at causes of this, it's really not too difficult to figure out. You have population growth, which is driving increased consumption, a need for additional food. They have people that have a better standard of living today than they did in years past. And so their diets are changing. They're eating more, looking for more things. And then the other thing is the energy consumption. Again, as people enjoy economic benefits in this world, they look to electricity to give them things that they never dreamed of before. So this increasing, seemingly insatiable energy consumption is a huge contributor to the global warming and the climate change. So to kind of wrap up, I think we need, as we always do, good leadership. We need cooperation among people. We need common cause. We need folks, nations, leaders to come together and to work hard to do what we can do that's reasonable. And there's some trend lines that I think are moving in the right direction. The consumption of coal, the use of coal, for example, as the primary source of energy generation is declining. I think oil is, we're beginning to see that as well. There's a migration from dirtier to a little less dirty to a little less dirty, and coal to oil to gas. You have a lot of renewable emphasis on renewables. It's a small fraction of energy generation these days, but moving in the right direction. So I think we need to work on these things. There's lots of possibilities, and I think we can make a difference if we worked hard together. Thanks very much. I'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Admiral, for that really serious look at where the world is today, as well as giving us some of those indications of hotspots, quite literally, where we might see some of this conflict already start bubbling up and certainly going in a tough direction. But I like that you also gave us some hope there in terms of trend lines that are finally, I suppose, moving in a good direction globally. So thank you. I'm going to pass it now over to someone who I'm sure, especially for UCLA, needs no introduction himself, but that's Congressman Ted Lieu, who represents the California's 33rd district in the U.S. House of Representatives. And he's happily on his third term in Congress, sitting on the very powerful committees of House Judiciary and House Foreign Affairs, both of which I can imagine look at some of these issues. And Congressman Lieu is himself was an active duty officer in the U.S. Air Force, currently a colonel in the reserves. So has also seen this from the perspective of security of his own sort of effort and ability to defend American lives. And beyond that, Congressman Lieu has been a really outspoken proponent on this issue of tackling climate change. The first bill he introduced in Congress was the Climate Solutions Act. And this goes way back, he was telling us, to his time in the California State Senate and State Assembly, where he also led on the issue of tackling climate change. So Congressman, happy to pass it over to you for you to tell us about what that journey has been like, as well as how you think that these issues are really impacting Americans where they are today.
Thank you, Kate, for that wonderful introduction. And I want to thank JR and the Luskin Center for Innovation for putting together this wonderful event, along with the Berkel Center. And I'm honored to be on with the amazing panelists today, Admiral Fallon and Professor Orr. I want to sort of start by first saying that we have both good news and bad news. So the bad news is we are warming, but the good news is more and more people are recognizing that and trying to take some action. So the reason that I ran for Congress is because of climate change. When I was in the California State Legislature, I was pleased to have been a co-author of AB 32, California's landmark Global Warming Solution Act. That was one of the first laws in the world to mandate reductions in greenhouse gases. A few years later, I concluded that California could simply stop using energy, go dark tomorrow, and it wouldn't matter. Because as global warming implies, it's a global problem. So what we need is America to do what California has done, and then the rest of the world to do what California has done. And then we might have a chance at successfully tackling climate change. So the first bill I wrote in Congress, as Kate said, was modeled on California's Global Warming Solutions Act. And I think one of the reasons that California's laws have worked pretty well is instead of the legislature saying, hey, here's 791 specific things we want you to do to combat climate change, it instead set goals, and then it gave an agency enormous power to take the state to achieve those goals. And in California, it was the California Air Resources Board. So legislation I introduced in Congress does something similar. It says by 2035, we're going to go to 100% renewable energy. We're also going to go to 40% reduction of all greenhouse gases. And by 2050, we'll go to 80% reduction of all greenhouse gases. And then we give the Department of Energy and the EPA immense power to take us there. The bill is not going to pass this term. If we need climate change legislation to get done in Congress, you're going to have voters basically change the makeup of the U.S. Senate and change the makeup of the White House. And then if that were to happen, then we could get some climate legislation through. The reason we have to do this is because climate change directly affects our national security in two ways. First of all, it directly impacts military readiness. In 2019, the Department of Defense released a congressionally mandated report that showed 79 bases are currently under threat because of climate change. 53 of those U.S. military bases were vulnerable to repeated flooding, and then 43 were vulnerable to, 53 for repeated flooding, 43 were vulnerable to drought, and 36 were vulnerable to wildfires. In addition, fuel use is one of the major logistical challenges of the U.S. military, and energy use as well. So if you can make it so that we reduce the necessity of trying to get fuel to our troops all the time, or having to airdrop batteries to our troops in the middle of combat so they can use the systems they need, that would also help our military combat capabilities. And that's why the Department of Defense has recognized climate change as a threat to military readiness. It's also a threat in the ways that Admiral Fallon and Kate Guy identified, which is creating essentially instabilities around the world that then necessitate U.S. intervention or intervention by other countries, or causing countries to conflict with each other. So Kate had listed some of the sort of the general problems that climate change causes. I just want to get to some specific areas where we've seen this happen. So for example, in the 2000s, a prolonged drought linked to climate change in the Middle East contributed to crop failures, an exodus of farmers, and food and water insecurity. A report by the Center for Climate and Security in 2012 found that those environmental factors, along with some other ones, contributed to the political turmoil in Syria, a problem that we still have not solved. And Syria continues to be a huge disaster. But the impetus of it, part of it was caused by environmental factors. Admiral Fallon mentioned the problem with ice melting. So in addition to flooding, it also causes conflict. So when the Arctic ice melts, countries like Russia and China want to go there and drill for oil. And that also causes conflict among different countries. And let's not rule out the United States. Both ExxonMobil and Shell, when they were lying to the US about climate change not being real and global warming not being real, they had internally planned to go drill in the Arctic because they knew the ice was going to melt. I'm glad that ExxonMobil finally now has admitted that climate change is real. The company does support a carbon fee. So at least we do see a change now compared to a couple of decades ago. Other countries experiencing huge problems, for example, include Bangladesh, because when all this ice melts and the water goes somewhere, unfortunately, a lot of it goes up near Bangladesh and starts flooding, which then causes millions of people to be displaced. And then United States, we see increased droughts, wildfires, and hurricanes hitting us. And that also affects our National Guard. That's got to go and deploy and deal with these disasters. So we have huge problems that we're facing, and we need to take immediate steps to tackle this. So one is passing legislation through Congress. The other is making sure we work with other countries around the world. So if the voters decide to change the makeup of the White House, then we will get back into the Paris Climate Accord. Unfortunately, our current president is simply lying about Paris Climate Accord. I don't think he knows what it is, nor has he read it. It is not a mandate. It's a voluntary program. And each country in the Accord voluntarily determines how we want to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and by how much. We also have to make sure that everyone from younger generations on up understand that this is not a hoax. And the good news is most people now believe it is not a hoax. A couple of decades ago, even when I was working on this issue in California State Legislature, you still had a number of people, primarily conservatives, who would not admit that climate change was happening. Most of them now admit it is, in fact, happening. And I was very heartened that in a foreign affairs hearing we had last year, the ranking Republican member on the committee came right out in his opening statement and said climate change is real, largely caused by human beings, and it's having an effect on our national security. Now we're just trying to work with enough conservatives to actually get some legislation passed. And so hopefully we can get that done next term. So with that, happy to answer any questions you may have. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak.
Thank you so much, Congressman, both for your work and leadership on this issue, as well as for some of that inside look you've been able to give us, both at the security threats we're facing, as well as where we could go. I think it's really interesting, a few things that you said. First, that national security is one of the only spaces that your colleagues on the other side of the aisle have really come to the table in recent years during the Trump administration, in small numbers, of course, but some of them have been brave enough to talk about security consequences associated with climate change and actually come to the table in some form on this in recent years. So thanks to all you've done, I'm sure, behind the scenes to make many of those conversations possible and actually get some new legislation on the books requiring those studies, as you say, for the Pentagon to start looking at this issue. But also, I mean, everything you have done in California and many people on this call, I'm sure, has made it so that California as a state can punch well above its weight as one of 50 states and continue leading the world in this issue, providing a model for what legislation can look like. And now that the U.S. has sort of signaled that it wants to renege on its commitments in the Paris Agreement and leave the world stage, it's so good to see Californians and delegations of Californians still come to UN climate meetings each year and represent everything that you've done. So it's great to see that leadership continue during these times. So thank you so much. All right. With that, we'll pass it on to our last distinguished speaker before moving to a discussion between everyone, and that's Dr. David Orr of Oberlin College. Dr. Orr is the Paul Sears Distinguished Professor of Environmental Studies and Politics Emeritus, and has long been a senior advisor and counselor to the president of Oberlin College. But beyond that, he is a real top-tier expert on this issue, particularly how the politics of climate change have played out over time and what might be coming because of that. So he's the author of 8 books, all with increasingly dire names. So Down to the Wire, Confronting Climate Collapse, and more recently, Dangerous Years, Climate Change, The Long Emergency, and The Way Forward, which I think in their titles speak to so much of what we've already talked about, and has written countless articles and reviews and book chapters on this. And he's also really sort of put his commitments where his research lies and served as board members and advisors to foundations and organizations working on building response to this issue, and has also advised government and helped build what we need to in terms of infrastructure and education around the world on this issue. And as he'll tell us, he's actually been working on this far longer than most of our leaders in government have even even known it was a problem. So Dr. Orr, let me pass it over to you to give us some remarks.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction. And it's such an honor to be on the same platform with you, Admiral Fallon, and Congressman Lieu. Let me begin by noting that we've known about climate change as a serious policy issue since, say, roughly 1965. The first warning was given to a U.S. president, Lyndon Johnson at the time, in 1965. I worked briefly on Jimmy Carter's transition team in 1977, and we've known enough to have acted on this issue a long time ago. And so the elephant in this room, no pun intended, but the elephant in this room is, why didn't we act sooner? We knew this was going to be an existential issue, threaten the very foundations of this country and civilization. So let me start with that observation as a question. But let me also ask the foundational issues here for foreign policy. George Kennan, probably the dean of U.S. diplomats, certainly in the middle years of the 20th century, said that foreign policy doesn't begin over yonder someplace, it begins at home. And so this is very much a political issue. Part of the answer to the question I posed at the beginning, why didn't we act sooner, is rooted in American politics. Based on the testimony of Admiral Fallon and Kate and Congressman Lieu, I think we could say climate change is a scientific certainty as much as anything in science ever is. The data is very clear, as Admiral Fallon pointed out. It's hard, it's firm, it gets more clear almost by the week. We know now the issue is longer term than we once thought, or some people once thought. Once carbon is in the atmosphere or heat trapping gases are in the atmosphere, they will stay there a long time, so centuries to millennia. We are changing the Earth's climate for essentially ever as humans measure time. We know that this affects everybody on Earth. There is no safe space left on the planet. And we all have to begin to deal with this issue, that this really is one world, and no nation state can make itself safe and seal off its borders, because the climate is and the oceans are global. And so at some point, and scientists can debate the point, but it's a little bit like going down a super highway and there are exit ramps to better destination than what is dead ahead. We're now just a bit over 1 degree centigrade warming. We'll be lucky in the thinking of many scientists to be able to stop this at 1.5 degree centigrade warming, which was the Paris Accord aspiration. That's going to be a tough goal to meet. It can be, I think, still met, but it's going to be hard to meet it. And then at 2 degrees centigrade or higher than that, all bets are off. At some point, as a recent scientific study put it, we'll experience simply cascading systemic failures that affect our food supply, our water, our energy systems, and eventually our economy and political stability. This is a 5-alarm fire. Let there be no mistake about that. I think there's a second point I want to make is this. We have to decide what kind of issue is this? And our tendency is to think, as Americans, think that it's an economic issue primarily. And so we'll create incentives and the market will take care of climate change. And it is, in a very real way, it is part of the economic, but not entirely. Other people would think it's a technological issue, and it certainly will require a different kind of technology, making a transition from fossil fuel burning and combustion generally to technologies that rely on efficiency and solar energy in its variety of forms, from solar electric to wind energy. But then it's also a moral and political issue. We have an obligation to act. The U.S. Constitution mentions posterity only once in the preamble and never thereafter. But this is an issue that we're passing on a dysfunctional planet to our children and to their children. That's a moral issue. And then finally, the brunt of what I'd like to say is, if we solve climate change, as the previous speakers have pointed out, we have to act politically. And this is an election year. This is the time to act. And we're getting very close to the last time that we can act and have any expectation of a safe destination. So we can't fix climate. Jim Hansen, the famous climate scientist, says, until we first fix our democracy. So the challenge to us is to go back and rethink how we have done public policy. Why did we take so long to act on this issue? And we still haven't acted yet. There's still no de jure or legally binding climate policy in this country. So we have to act politically. And I think if we look at the current pandemic, the pandemic is in a very small way, in a very temporary way, as bad as it is, as awful it is for many, many people. It's a small, temporary foretaste of what climate change will bring us. Interrupted supply chain, economic devastation, unemployment, illness. Climate change itself will incur pandemics. And as Admiral Fallon pointed out, rising sea levels that threaten coastal cities and food supplies and energy systems. It threatens everything. And so this is the time to begin to think about how we put together a plan that deals, that incorporates science in public policy in ways that are effective, not just on COVID, but now on climate change. And if I was to put the question this way, if the founding fathers, since the word originalism is very much in the public mind right now, if the founding fathers had known in, say, 1787, when they wrote the Constitution, what we know now about how the earth works as a physical system, how would they then have written a constitution for a world of feedback loops and leads and lags and long time horizons and ecological global interconnectedness? So it leads me finally to the point, my current work is involved in, and somebody can flip the next slide, it's involved in a longer term conversation about democracy. The State of American Democracy Project included a book that came out earlier this year, Democracy Unchained, a series of 11 online events now, intended to be live events, but now online events that involve about 100 different speakers and experts and so forth, around the theme of rebuilding and repairing and reinventing American democratic institutions. So this is in every way a political challenge, and there's no safe space on the planet. Anybody who thinks they can make the United States alone safe is simply mistaken. This is now a global challenge, and we have to come together. And so if we will build a secure world, we have to build a together world. We have to rebuild global institutions. And that's going to start in our case with rebuilding a lot of our own democracy institutions locally, starting with how we vote in fair electoral districts, repairing and rebuilding and re-energizing American democracy as it might have been. So I'll stop there with simply just saying that this is every way, it is a political challenge to this country and to the entire world. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that historical context, but the imperative that we're facing really in just the next few days, which might themselves feel like many decades between now and next Tuesday. But certainly with everything on the line that we've just been speaking of. And I think it's interesting that you speak to the fact that, presidents were warned about this by security experts back in 1968. And I think the quote that you're speaking of was later released in now unclassified documents, but actually called climate change a more serious threat than even nuclear weapons back then, that it could have that big of an impact, that even a President Johnson should think of them in the way we think of nuclear weapons. And certainly that's not been how many presidents have seen this since then. So why don't I pose my first question to you, Dr. Orr, and then we'll sort of go down the line and some other questions to the other speakers. You talk about how democracy is sort of at this crossroads, that climate change is at this crossroads. And certainly a new Biden presidency or a new Congress, even if it is a Trump presidency, will have to really do something about both of these questions very quickly. So let me ask, how do you see the climate and democratic sort of projects intersecting? You've spoken about how to fix the climate problem, we need to fix the democratic problem, but are there ways we can do both at the same time? And perhaps thinking internationally, does the promotion of democracy sort of interact with the promotion of climate adaptation? What do you think?
Well, two comments. One is on any particular problem, the muddy little footprints of causation go back to some political body, a local board of counselors, a governor's office, courts, regulatory bodies, the Congress, the presidency itself. And so these things are the cork in the bottle has been the inability of certain political actors to act. The second thing I'd say is this, climate change requires, in many ways, a bottom-up revolution in how we power our lives. It means energy-efficient homes and well-designed cities that eliminate the need for combustion. But then it also means top-down legislation. It means, as Congressman Lieu pointed out, we've got to have a framework within which we can act. And so this isn't market versus government. This is government, market, and the civil sector, the NGO sector of society. So it's everybody. And I don't think anybody can be left out. We've left the fossil fuel world has created lots of victims in the world, including future generations. Nobody can be left out of this. We have to bring everybody along with us, and we will need their energies. We need the brain power of the 7.5 billion smart humans on this planet. And the last thing I'd say is that requires massive changes, I think, in how we educate. And if we were to start with educating Congresspeople, if I was to ask Congressman Lieu, how many of his colleagues does he think could pass a basic exam on Earth system science? The percentage, I'm sure, I don't want to put him on the spot, but I think the percentage would be pretty low. And yet you have to get a car license, you have to take a test, and you have to know something about the highways and the operating rules of the road. But you don't have to know the operating rules of planet Earth to be a congressperson or a senator or even, heaven forbid, a U.S. president. I'll rest my case for that.
Thank you so much, Professor. And yes, I think you're right, and I think I'll pose a version of that to the congressman and see if your projections are correct in that. But you're probably right that there's a sort of generational educational program we need to engage in here. If we're going to prioritize this issue to the levels that we need to be teaching all of our students how this impacts any career that they're going in, be it engineering or, psychology and health and all of these issues. There will be some element of climate there. But Congressman, let's put you on the spot. How many of your colleagues do you think really understand the severity of these risks that we've just outlined, or at least take seriously the problem that we're facing? And maybe as a second add-on to that, do you think that there is movement enough that a new Congress early next year could really prioritize this issue the way it needs to?
Thank you for your question. So I'll answer your second question first. If the American people do not flip the Senate and the White House, then nothing will be done on climate change for the next 4 years. We likely would actually regress because the current president has made statements that he believes climate change is a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese. Now, in terms of if the American people did flip the White House and the Senate, then I think we would take some significant climate action starting next year. If anyone watched Vice President Joe Biden's acceptance speech at the DNC convention, he listed 4 topics, priorities he was going to work on. One of them was climate change. Then regarding your first question about what do people know about climate change in Congress, my guess is every single Democrat take climate change seriously. And then I think about 20% to about a third of Republicans do. So that's my sense of where you are in the House. I think in the Senate, significantly less Republicans do. I think a number of them actually still think that climate change is a hoax.
That's interesting. I mean, it's sort of sad to hear that hoax narrative is still so dominant, even when, as we all heard Admiral Fallon say, this is something that the security community has long been identifying as a threat. I really can't think of many other security threats that we would allow a senator or a Congress person to bury their head in the sand around. Do you think that there is sort of any movement there in the future matching the political awakening that we've seen around this issue domestically?
So we have seen movement where now very few Republican members of Congress will come out and say climate change is not real, partly because they can't actually dispute measurements. I mean, they can't dispute the more frequent climate disasters we're seeing, whether it's wildfires or severe hurricanes or droughts. Now they sort of shift to, well, how do we solve that? Certainly, we shouldn't do it through, all these ways that we think would actually make sense. So they sort of rely on, either magical thinking, or hopefully it's going to somehow the industry is going to take care of it. None of that is actually going to happen. I think what we need are we're going to have to put laws in to put in the proper incentives to reduce carbon. And right now, carbon is mispriced in the free market. We don't adequately price carbon for the damage it's causing to the environment. If we adequately priced carbon, we could do a lot to reduce climate change.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, sir, for telling it like it is. And Admiral Fallon, let's bring you in here. I mean, you've seen so much of this up close, and you told us about how many of the places you operated in are already witnessing these risks and these new security instabilities as they spiral. I'm curious, sort of all of the threats on the table, which one maybe scares you the most, or which few threats are the ones that keep you up at night, and in your most esteemed knowledge, do you think is the one that we're going to really have some challenges facing?
I don't know about any esteemed knowledge, and I tend to be a lot less interested in the political fights and finger pointing as I am in practical matters, and let's figure out how we get moving in this thing. But I want to make a couple of comments. Going back to, you picked the year, 60s, 70s, whenever. It isn't like, wow, we need to have clean air and no carbon in the air and so forth and so on. So there are reasons why this has been hard. And I'm not apologizing for any of them, but just I think it's good to keep in mind a little reality check here to get ourselves grounded. And so probably, in my mind, one of the biggest drivers of the environmental damage that's occurred has been for actually some very good and highly desirable reasons. Number one being the desire to electrify this country. So go back 100 years, and the potential for having electricity do everything from provide light at night to make life easier in growing food and in any number of household things. Again, back at the personal level, the individual level, forget the state issues. Let's focus on people. And people were very, very anxious to get the availability of electricity. And so when that was pushed to a large extent in this country, you look around, how do you generate electricity? And that was done primarily with coal because it was readily available. It worked. It had a high energy content, and it went on. So in this country now, we're very well off. We're very blessed with a lot of resources, and we have options. But a lot of those options are not available to other people in other countries of the world. And so if people had options, then it would be much easier to change and knock off some of the bad habits. But I'll give you an example of, first of all, to not let us in the U.S. off the hook. We're one of the top 2 problem children in this whole business of global warming and all that goes with it. The other main actor today is China. And I've personally had an opportunity to watch China go from very, very immature, low-grade economy back a few decades ago, and then as it picked up, they wanted all the things that the Western world wanted, and beginning with electricity and the ability to power lots of things. And so I then watched that climate go from okay to unbelievably poor, but they're working on it. They've made a lot of changes in and around Beijing that I've been able to witness personally, and they're working on it. But they have hundreds of millions of people that still desperately want these things, that many of the things we enjoy and they don't have. And if you step down to other countries that are even less fortunate in the world, again, they're really desperate to have the better life that energy generation provides. And so it shouldn't be a shock or a surprise that there's resistance to suddenly saying, well, we'll stop using all fossil fuels and we're going to go to, you pick whatever the green energy source of your choice may be. It's going to take a while. But we have to, I think, work at educating people and providing alternatives. And the congressman made one word that I circled and underlined. That was incentives. And I think this is really important. And I think we can go a lot further in making the changes that all of us would appreciate and would like to see if we not take the option of we're going to pummel people and direct them to do this and that and the other thing or else, but come up with practical incentives that will motivate people to do and change their behaviors. And I think that's the key to human nature in every endeavor. And I think it's really important here. And I think we can make progress. I would just highlight one other observation, and that is earlier this year in the COVID-induced world of environmental change, economic activity came to a screeching halt in many of the most developed places in the world. And the change in atmosphere, very visible change, was remarkable, I think. And I think it's indicative of, may not be the end of the world coming next week, that with a little bit of effort and attention to detail and cooperation, and we get our acts together in sync, that we could make progress. But back to your number of the question that you really wanted me to answer, the biggest challenge, I think, is water. We have to have water to live. We have to have fresh water to drink. So we get a lot of it in the oceans, but it's kind of salty, and you need fresh water. And as this fresh water disappears in the form of melting glaciers, ice caps, and so forth, I believe that the potential for conflict that could result is very, very high. And this is not something that we're going to change overnight or in a decade or something. It's a very long-term issue. But I think recognizing that and doing something about it. The other thing in developed countries like ours, the number one thing that I believe would be particularly useful is to become a lot more efficient in our use of energy. We're profligate wasters of energy. You pick it, you name it. And so anyway, I could go on, but we have the power to change this. And I think the approach I'd like to see is a series of well thought out incentives to motivate people, point out the problems, and then let's figure out how we cooperate and get some results.
That's great. I'm glad you brought up incentives, because I'm going to ask each of you about incentives in different ways, but actually pulling in the questions that we've gotten from the audience that are touching on each of these issues. So Admiral Fallon, let me start back to you. And I'm curious about incentives for the military and the Pentagon itself, right? So we know that the Pentagon is one of the largest consumers of energy in the world. So much goes into its own carbon budget. So one of the questioners wanted to know specifically how you might go about lowering and decarbonizing our armed forces, of course, in a way that maintains military readiness. But what incentives would the military need to be able to do that new level of innovation?
Well, I'd say, first of all, we're not going to decarbonize the military anytime soon, because the motors, the engines that provide the power for most of our vehicles come from fossil fuels, and that's not something that's going to be changed very quickly. However, I would point out that we happen to have one asset that I believe is being grossly underused today, and it's one that causes a lot of people to gasp and suck in unnecessarily, and that's nuclear power. We have a generation capacity in this country today of over 20% of the generating capacity is nuclear power. And we are, through a series of, I believe, mistakes and other decisions, allowing this green energy there's zero emissions. It's very, very helpful, and we're not taking advantage of it. In the military, you have, particularly in the Navy, most of the capital ships are in fact nuclear powered. And again, on the business of, oh my gosh, nuclear, and the hand-wringing starts, having lived and operated on nuclear powered ships for several decades and sleeping right on top of reactors, in addition to overseeing and leading the crews that maintain these with zero safety issues, zero injuries, zero deaths. I'm quite convinced this is readily doable. But anyway, that's just one thing. But back to the other. So a couple of practical things that can be done and are being done now. There's a transformation, I believe, that's underway in the military to transition to more remotely operated vehicles. And these tend to typically be smaller and less demanding of energy sources. And as this trend continues, I think this will be a significant help in reducing the overall energy demand, and something that I believe could be done. I've felt this way for a long time, that the design of most of these, back to the motors, the engines that drive particularly our vehicles that traverse the earth, there's been no real motivation or incentive to make these things particularly efficient. And so in my experience in Navy vessels carrying things around the world for our forces, all forces, Navy, Army, Marine Corps, Air Force, my experience is that about 70% of what we carry around the world on our ships is liquid. The vast majority of it is fuel. And this is something that we can make headway with in practical matters. There are a lot of glitzy glam jobs. So let's have a green aircraft engine. We'll put some green fuel in there, and this will be wonderful. Most of that's a bunch of bunk, but we could, in fact, design today motors that are much more efficient, fuel efficient, and thereby increase our overall efficiency, cut down on demand signal for these difficult to deal with fuels, and be a lot less polluting. So there are a lot of things that could be done. Again, practical ways. We put people to work on it, tell them, let's think about it. What can we do differently? And then incentivize them to do it. And I think we could see some big changes. Thank you.
Thank you. No, thanks for that inside knowledge. And I think your point out of incentives moving beyond just the military itself is important, right? That there are demand signals that can be sent by the military taking these things seriously that will permeate into the rest of the economy. But Congressman Lieu, on incentives for your side, we had a question come in specifically about the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis and the seminal report put out this year, and the plan of action that was communicated in that report from your mostly, I think, only Democratic colleagues. So assuming the change that you were speaking of being necessary in the administration and in Congress, say that happens in the next week, what would the incentives look like then to really get that action plan through? And would that be a good roadmap that Democrats would want to follow for a lot of these issues?
Thank you for that question. Before I answer it, I was told that Fran Pavley is one of the attendees. And as many of you know, she was an amazing state senator and environmentalist, and she authored AB 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act. So I just want to give a shout out to her. In terms of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, it did a fabulous report that all of you can get online, and all of you should read it, that lays out not just laws that should be passed, but also regulatory actions that can be taken and other actions that are not just laws. And so I think that's important for people to understand, that this is going to take a variety of different actions from different people and different communities all over the world getting together to try to combat climate change. One of the first things that the United States would do if the American people do change the makeup of the White House is to put us back into the Paris Climate Accord. So that's number one. And then number two, I do think there will be legislation that will pass definitely the House, and depending on whether the Senate flips or not. If it does, then we'll get climate change legislation to the president's desk. If the Senate doesn't flip, you're basically going to see what has happened the last 2 years, where the House passes a lot of good bipartisan legislation that simply dies on Senator Mitch McConnell's desk. And so it depends on what the American people do this November.
Thank you. Well, November's around the corner, so hopefully we go in the direction that would be helpful in that way. So one final question to Professor Orr, and then I'm going to hit you all with a wrap question. And this is also from a panelist, and I think speaks to incentives and perhaps incentives of our own democracy as we act in the world. So what obligations do you think the United States has to other countries, specifically those less developed countries that will have to build immense climate resiliency in the next few years? And these might be countries where the U.S. has not been external player, has actually involved itself in the democracies of these countries from Latin America to the Middle East. So what obligations does the U.S. have there?
Okay, good question. Before I try to answer that, I think in terms of incentives, one of the things that needs to happen very quickly is to desubsidize oil, coal, and natural gas, level the playing field for renewable energy and also efficiency. That's been hard to do because selling fossil fuels is a $3 trillion a year business. And that is reflected in what Jane Mayer, a New Yorker, calls dark money that flows into American politics. If you ask, why didn't we act earlier to do the things that we could have done that were economically advantageous, would have been good for national security, part of the answer comes back in our politics were corrupted badly by money we can't even trace because of Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court. The first obligation, to answer your question, I think we have to the world is to get our own house in order. America has an outsized effect on what happens in the world, for good or bad. A lot of it's good, some of it is not so good. And to get our own house in order, and democracy around the world is in retreat, partly because it's in retreat here. Countries around the world look back at the United States and see infringements on freedom of the press and corruption of the White House, and various kinds of ways that are now being politicized. But I think our first obligation to the world is get our own house in order. And then on Admiral Fallon's point, I think we have an obligation to help other countries leapfrog our kind of old technology. The grid is the largest machine ever built on the planet, but you don't need to have a grid now. Renewable energy and efficiency and better urban design allows you to eliminate a lot of the energy. So if somebody was to ask, how much energy does it take to run the United States, let's say, at a lifestyle that we like, and that accounts for economic growth, comfort, and security, and so forth, it's probably well under half of what we presently use. When Admiral Fallon says that we're wastrels and profligate users of energy, he's exactly right. That's the system we designed, and it was profitable for some to make us profligate consumers of energy. So I think there's a lot that we have to do, and it starts right home, and I think that George Kennan was right a long time ago, that our foreign policy begins with our domestic policies and getting our house in order.
Absolutely. More true now than ever if we want the rest of the world to trust us if we come back into this project. All right, so we're running to time here, but I'm going to ask each of you a last quick question, and it's a big one, but try to keep your maybe answers short and limited as we see this conversation out. And one of the people in the audience asked about this question we've been wrestling with along the way of taking science seriously and having government and military particularly accept these scientific findings and then act on them. So I wanted to ask each of you in your own spheres, what would it take sort of structurally to get your colleagues, the people you work with, Admiral Fallon in the military, Congressman Lieu in Congress, and Professor Orr, you can pick which institution you want to focus on, be it academia or democracies at large. What would it structurally demand to integrate the science, particularly the science around the security impacts, better into the workings of your institution? Congressman Lieu, why don't we start with you?
Thank you for that question. So what I'm going to say is not partisan. It might sound like it, but it's simply just facts. So we know, for example, that there was a whole huge march for science. Why would the American people do that? They did that because the Trump administration has repeatedly attacked science. It'd be like if people had a march for math, right? It was so ridiculous to me when I first heard about this march, but then it made sense because never before have we seen an elected administration simply go out of its way to reject science. And when you look at what's happened, especially with this pandemic, we know that the administration, for example, placed political people into the Department of Health and Human Services and into our National Institutes of Health and into the CDC for the purpose of suppressing what the doctors and medical experts were saying. That continues now when the President of the United States flatly disregards a lot of what Dr. Fauci has said. The president continues to do rallies where there is no social distancing, little wearing of masks. And then I don't know where the president gets his facts from. Today, he said that in California, we have a special mask where we can eat through it with this complicated mechanism. This is the president of the United States talking. He has no idea what he's talking about. And he has the best access to the best info in the world, and he is not using it. So I don't know how to fix that. The American people can fix it if they decide to change and make it the White House in November. I'm not pointing fingers. I'm just stating facts. And when you have a president of the United States that rejects science because he believes it would hurt him politically, we are in a bad state in our society right now. I hope the American people see that.
Certainly. So a simple but all the more important because of that call for bringing facts more central and science more central to each decision made, even when the politics don't agree. Let me go to Professor Orr. What is your sort of big idea as to how we should be thinking about these structural changes?
Well, I want to follow Congressman Lieu's very astute comments and just say that the president has rejected science on climate issues. He's rejected science on COVID. But several weeks ago, when they took him to Walter Reed Hospital, he wanted the best science that was available to cure him of COVID, to get him back in operation. So you can't have it both ways. You've got to have science built into everything. And that's just simply fact-based, logical, research-based activity. Two things I would add to this. In 1994, Newt Gingrich and Republicans zeroed out the budget for the Office of Technology Assessment, which is kind of like turning the headlights off on your car on a windy mountain road moving at high speed. We had no way to forecast the growth of science, what was good and what was bad, and where we ought to be moving. Third thing I would say is this: America ranks remarkably low in national or international standards of scientific literacy. And I think that that is a tragic mistake. We need a scientifically literate public, a public that knows how the world works physically and appreciates science in the worlds of fact, data, and logic. And nowhere is it more clear than on issues of climate change or national security or pandemics. We live in a world now that our headlights have got to be on this windy, dark road. We're moving at very fast speed, but scientific literacy is important. And that means, I think, dealing with a lot of the misinformation. I don't want to get into QAnon, but there's a good bit of very deliberate misinformation being fed in the American public. And I'll leave it to Congressman Lieu and other people better equipped to know how to deal with those things. But we need science built into the way we think about the world. The last thing I'd say is this: we have a Supreme Court justice now who purports not to know anything about climate change. He assumes it's a controversy. And so that's corrupting that institution, I think, at the very, very highest level. I'll rest my case there.
Thank you, sir. And I hear what you're saying about scientific illiteracy actually making us vulnerable in a security sense as well. So, Admiral Fallon, what do you think about this? How can we better structure science, particularly in the military, where it's so central, as Dr. Orr has told us? What should we be doing?
Well, I don't think it's necessary to restructure anything along those lines. I think your senior military and defense officials are very well aware of what the realities are in this world and what needs to happen. I think, unfortunately, we're spending too much time in the political realm that I would much rather, again, get into some real measures. So there are lots of things that we could do in this country to reduce our demand on our own energy. We could make use of what's already readily available. I mentioned the nuclear power plants that are already up and constructed and operating that provide a baseline of power and capacity that would go a long way to helping us reduce some of the fossil fuels that we come to depend on. We could. A lot of this is, in fact, frankly, in the congressman's domain. We continue to offer a lot of incentives, I think, that are outmoded. They're in the wrong direction. We propagate interesting figments of imagination, the greenness of ethanol, for example, which, if you go back and look at where it comes from, we're now diverting incredible amounts of water and what could be food sources to burning up another kind of a fuel. But anyway, I think it's we need to make some hard choices. We need to get serious about it, and people, I believe, need to be understanding that it's individuals that make a difference. Each one of us can help along this road to a better world, a better globe. Again, somebody mentioned earlier that there are no boundaries on this spread of dirty air and of the warming. It's all over the world and doesn't recognize any political boundaries. But there's a lot we could do, a lot we should do. I don't think we need too many structural changes. Those that are in positions to understand this, I think, really get it. I think those who somehow deny this or are either propagating another political hoax or some other thing. But the fact of the matter is, we need to take action now. We need to do it collectively. We need to do it smartly. And I think we'd be much better served if we did it by coming up with clever ways to incentivize people to better behavior than trying to cudgel them into some response. So there's a lot we can do. But again, I'm going to end, if I could, I think we're about out of time here, is there is hope for optimism. Again, the big trend lines in the fossil fuel world are moving in a much better direction. And again, this little example that we saw, this window of what happened during the change in industrial output for a couple of months made a phenomenal difference in a very short period of time. And so just saw a statistic last week that the air quality in Washington, D.C. area, for example, is the best it's been since they started keeping records. Now, haven't been keeping records that long. They started keeping those records because it got nasty and dirty. But I think there's reason to be optimistic if we will take the initiative to get cracking on and do something for real, not just talk about it. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sarah, for that optimism to lead us out, and to all of the panel for bringing your deep critiques, even inspiring some debate across each of us, because this is clearly something that, as Admiral Fallon said, is difficult and it's hard and has been for a while for a variety of reasons. But it's good to know that our military is taking this seriously and taking these threats and the science behind them seriously. Now we just need to, as the Congressman said, and Professor Orr and Admiral Fallon, go so much further to confront these threats. And I saw one final question that if anyone's interested in where the research from the beginning presentation came from, it's a security threat assessment of global climate change from the Center for Climate and Security, and it's the pinned link in my Twitter page if that's of interest to anybody. But thanks again to this remarkable panel and all of the wisdom and ideas you brought to it. Let me pass it to JR to close things out, and apologies for running a bit over time with this great discussion.
Kate, thank you so much for your skilled and excellent moderation, and thank you to our esteemed panelists for taking time out of your busy schedules to share with us, your perspectives on these questions. And I want to thank the staff of the Luskin Center and the Burkle Center, particularly calling out Michelle Einstein and Christian Zarate for making this virtual event possible. And I want to thank you, the participants, for your interest, your willingness to learn. We all have a role to play in making our climate and our world safe and secure and equitable going forward. So it's something that I'm very grateful the Luskin Center could play a role in bringing together this conversation and helping to provide a deeper understanding of the challenges that we face and the goals that we need to set for ourselves collectively. The presentation will be, the PowerPoint slides will be shared with you in a follow-up. So that was a question that was asked. And then I just want to say thank you all for being here. We look forward to seeing you back here again soon. Have a great evening.